Okay, so I just thought I'd address something that's come up in my previous videos about the Mission 1Pro ILS, and that's to do with the idea of focal length and the crop factor of the sensor. Now, I've had people in the comments saying that you shouldn't get confused with focal length and the crop factor of the sensor. Now, nobody, as far as I know, least of all me, is getting confused with focal length and the crop factor. The focal length is a focal length. A 50mm lens will always be a 50mm lens. A 25mm lens will always be a 25mm lens. But the crop factor is important. Now, anyone who's bought a camera or knows about cameras will know that quite often manufacturers will say things such as a 15mm equivalent lens. And what they mean by that is that although the lens on the camera that they are selling might be, say, a 5mm lens, they say it's a 15mm equivalent because it gives the same field of view or the same composition as you would get on a full frame or 35mm camera with a 15mm lens. They're not saying that the 5mm lens is a 15mm lens. They're just saying that it gives you the same equivalent field of view as a 15mm lens on a full frame or 35mm camera, depending on the crop factor. You know, different sensors have different crop factors, and so they will have different 35mm or full frame equivalents. And yeah, that's important when we talk about the telephoto nature of a lens, because I had one person in the comments arguing that cropping into the lens is a bit like doing a digital zoom. It is actually nothing like a digital zoom. A digital zoom crops into the sensor, which obviously has a limited number of pixels, and then depending on the amount of crop, it might need to enlarge that back to the resolution of the recording. And that is obviously going to result in a lot of quality, unless you're doing something like zooming in 2 times for a 4K recording on an 8K sensor. Cropping into the lens is not the same thing. You're doing it optically. Now, there's an argument that there's a limitation on the resolving ability of a lens, particularly if you're, for example, cropping into it on an 8K sensor into the center of a lens. There's an argument that, well, can that lens still resolve 8K of detail? And that would be a valid point to make. But in general, we're used to the kinds of crop that we see on the Mission 1Pro ILS. The Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, the original one, had a very similar crop level. Its sensor, I believe, was actually slightly smaller than the one on the Mission 1Pro ILS. It was a Super 16 size sensor. So we're used to this kind of crop factor when it comes to lenses, and I don't remember anyone causing or kicking up a huge fuss about the crop factor on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. It was a thing, people did mention it, but there wasn't the kind of furore and backlash that you hear about the GoPro Mission 1 ILS, which is curious to say the least. With the BMP-CC, as it's otherwise known, I used a focal reducer, and what that did was it reduced the crop factor on the lenses. I used an adapter for Canon lenses on it, and it just meant that I could get a wider field of view on that camera. But it's important to note that that crop factor is very, very useful when it comes to getting telephoto images. It does mean that in order to get the same composition as a much bigger lens on a full frame camera, you can do it with a much lighter lens. So if I use a 50mm lens on the Mission 1Pro ILS, I'm going to get the same composition as I would with a 150mm lens on a full frame camera. That is just a fact. And you know, we can argue about the resolving ability of the lens when you're focusing on that center point of the glass, but the fact is that it's not the reduction of quality that you would get from a digital zoom in any way, shape or form. And we can see from the results that people have posted up, shot with the ILS, that it's not really an issue, is it? And for me, this is what makes the ILS so compelling. You know, I don't really need the ultra wide lens. I've got that on the Mission 1 Pro. And, you know, I think that for me, telephoto is probably more important than wide when it comes to using something like, you know, a manual interchangeable lens camera, particularly if I'm going to be carrying it around somewhere. The fact that I can use much smaller, lighter lenses for the same framing and composition that I would otherwise need a much larger lens for on a full frame mirrorless camera is a very attractive proposition for me, particularly when it comes to shooting adventure sports. It's a silly notion to expect GoPro to have put a larger sensor on this camera. You know, that would require an entire new body design, or entirely new everything, really. And with the aim of the ILS being that it would cost the same as the Mission 1 Pro, you know, there are limitations on what can be done, and that goes for, you know, electronic lens connections on top of that, because that again would incur a cost, would incur new design motives, and you know, and all that business, and that would make the camera much more expensive again, and then people would complain about that. So to conclude then, nobody's confusing focal length with crop factor. It's just that it is simply a fact that that crop factor does give you effectively more telephoto reach, you know, because as I say, it will give you the same composition for a lower focal length as you would need a higher focal length for on a full frame or larger sensor camera. It's just physics, you know, and it is nothing like a digital zoom in any way, shape or form. And as I say, we're very much used to this kind of crop factor going right back to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. It's just not a big deal unless you really want an ultra wide lens, in which case, as I say, you can get the Mission 1 Pro for the same price or less as a really good wide lens in the first place. So, you know, I'm not really sure what the objections are. I think some people are kicking up a fuss for no good reason other than they pretty much just want to find a way to bash GoPro. You know, there are people out there who do have, for some reason, whatever reason, a visceral hate of GoPro and want to criticise at every opportunity. And there might be some people with like genuine concerns, but the ILS is a camera that is going to suit some people and isn't going to suit others. And if it doesn't suit you, well, that doesn't mean that it doesn't suit everybody. There are people out there who, and I've spoken to them firsthand about all this, about how they're going to use or plan to use the ILS in their productions. You know, just because you don't have a use for it, it doesn't mean that lots of other people don't. And just because you have an issue with a particular factor on it, you know, that, for example, not being able to have a wide angle lens again, it doesn't mean that other people don't have a problem with it. You know, and they actually find the telephoto, like myself, actually find that crop factor advantageous and a useful thing rather than a hindrance. Dolly's obviously found something, hopefully not going to roll. Dolly! Obedient dog. But yeah, this was just a little bit of a rant to kind of put my viewpoint across on this. It just gets a bit frustrating for me when I see just the negative stuff coming out. instead of people just looking at it and going, okay, yeah, this camera would be useful for X, Y, Z. But instead, you get people going, well, you can't use it for that. You can't use it for this. I don't see the point of it. Well, maybe like widen your viewpoint a little bit, open yourself up a bit to the possibilities of what it can be used for, instead of finding the things that you don't think it can be used for. You know, if GoPro's made a bad business decision on this, we know GoPro's having, you know, financial issues at the moment, and it's looking pretty dire, I have to say. It's not looking very good. But at the end of the day, if GoPro's made that mistake, they've made that mistake. And if it's not going to sell, and you know, then what's it on you? What's it on me? You know, I can see a use for it, so it doesn't really matter to me, you know, what the sales figures actually are. I mean, obviously, I'd like to see GoPro survive, or at least if it is sold off, I'd like to see it, you know, go to a company that is going to respect what GoPro is all about. But you know, that's a completely separate subject, a completely separate video. But yeah, I would just say, just don't get hung up too much on this kind of stuff, and don't get so, there's no need to become so emotional about a camera or your thoughts on a company's business decisions. You know, it'll be what it will be. But as I say, if you look at the positives, if you look at how the camera can be used instead of how it can't be used, you might find some more creative ideas there for your own stuff. Yeah, I'm just, yeah, I just felt I had to make this because I'm just a bit fed up of some of the negativity that is around. And, you know, life is too short, really, to be focused all the time on why things can't work or can't be done, instead of how they can be done, and how things can be, and you know, how you can come up with new ideas rather than how you can't come up with new ideas. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's a bit of a rant for today. I haven't done a rant for a while, so I thought I'd had one today. Just if you're interested, I don't like carrying a lot of faff around with me when I go out and film these things. I like to do things pretty light and easy, and even when I'm going on you know, an extensive walk somewhere and I'm going to be doing more filming, I like to try and minimise the amount of kit that I take with me. I can't stand kit faff, but I found this really great selfie stick stroke tripod from Small Rig. I can't remember where I found out about it from, but I'm pretty much using it everywhere I go now, because you can hook it onto trees and fences and whatever. It can act as a short selfie stick and also a tripod for walk-bys and things. I find it really, really useful, and I'm pretty much taking it everywhere. Pretty good as a desktop tripod as well for doing webcams and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that, I don't really recommend many of these things because it's rare for me to find something as useful as this. But if you are interested, I've got a link to this below. Check it out, see if it's useful for your own uses. So anyway, that's my rant over, and normal service will be resumed in the next video. So if you like any of this, please do consider liking and subscribing and all that jazz, and I'll see you then.